Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into the deep, warm night of the ancient Mayan world, where the jungle hums softly around you, and moonlight drapes itself over towering stone temples. In the shadows between the trees, you hear the low, distant beat of a drum, steady, hypnotic, pulling you closer. As you reach the great plaza, your eyes catch a glimmer of movement high above. There at the very top of the central pyramid, a figure stands so still it could be carved from obsidian. But then the wind stirs, and something impossibly tall, impossibly colorful, shivers and glows in the silver light. The king's crown. Not a crown of gold or silver, mind you, but an enormous tower of feathers, each one shimmering like a drop of frozen rainbow. And you think, in the stillness of that moment, that you probably wouldn't survive a single day in this place. Mosquitoes the size of thumbtacks, jaguars that can climb trees faster than you can climb stairs, and humidity so thick it feels like you're breathing soup. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is dense with the smell of crushed leaves, ripe fruit, and a faint undercurrent of burning copal incense drifting up from the plaza below. You trudge forward, your sandals pressing into the worn limestone steps, feeling the texture of centuries underfoot. Somewhere far below, the villagers have gathered in flickering torchlight, and their eyes are fixed on the king. From here, you can see how the moon catches the feathers, long emerald plumes that sway and ripple, tipped with flecks of iridescent blue and gold. The structure rises from a carved headband in layers, each tier a different hue, until it forms a towering halo that almost brushes the night sky. And here's the strange thing. The king barely moves, yet the feathers dance as though alive, turning the air itself into a kind of slow-motion spectacle. Mainstream historians agree that these enormous feathered headdresses, sometimes taller than the men who wore them, were symbols of divine authority. The king was not just a ruler. He was the earthly embodiment of a god, and his hat, if you can even call something that size a hat, was a visual proclamation of that role. You couldn't miss it. You couldn't ignore it. You couldn't mistake him for anyone else, unless your neighbor also had a 10-pound rainbow tower glued to his skull, which, odds are, he didn't. But here's the quirky tidbit. The Mayans didn't just gather any feathers they liked from the jungle. No, some came from birds that were incredibly rare, whose plumage could only be gathered without harming them. The quetzal, for example, would die if its tail feathers were plucked roughly, so hunters had to capture the bird alive, remove the feathers with delicate care, and then release it back into the wild. It's like a royal salon day for birds, except the customer is wildly uncooperative, has razor-sharp claws, and can fly away mid-appointment. Historians still argue whether the full height of some recorded headdresses is accurate, or whether the Spanish chroniclers exaggerated them to make the Mayan rulers seem more exotic and alien to European readers. Some surviving depictions show hats so high they would have required a support frame or balancing strap hidden under the chin, sort of like the ancient version of those elaborate Met Gala outfits where you wonder if the celebrity can even sit down. From your vantage point, you can almost feel the weight of it. Imagine the pressure on the king's neck, holding his head perfectly straight for hours, never daring to scratch an itch. He stands on that high platform with the easy stillness of someone trained for years in the art of ceremonial endurance. The feathers catch every glint of moonlight and torchlight, turning him into something that doesn't belong entirely to the world of humans, a flicker of the divine in the humid dark. The drums slow, the air hangs heavy, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird cries out, a long, echoing note that dissolves into the blackness. Down below, the people wait for the king to speak. You realize that this isn't just a fashion statement. This is theater. The kind of theater where the stage is the entire city, and the performance might last until dawn. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the drums and the scent of the jungle wrap around you. In that quiet, you imagine the journey those feathers took to get here. The hunters in the green gloom of the forest, the artisans hunched over their work in lamplight, the traders carrying bundles wrapped in bark cloth along narrow jungle paths. all of it converging on this moment, under this moon, on this head. The king raises his hand slowly, so slowly you wonder if he's moving at all, and the plaza responds with a ripple of murmured prayer. You can't understand the words, but you feel their rhythm, a steady heartbeat of devotion. The crown sways gently, its colors shifting as if they were alive, and you know you're seeing something rare, a glimpse of an entire civilization's pride, power, and belief distilled into one impossible, beautiful object. Far above the noise of the crowd, a breeze stirs again, lifting the feathers just enough to make them quiver. For a moment, it almost looks like the crown might lift away entirely, like a flock of birds breaking free into the night sky. But the king's head remains steady, the weight firmly in place. This is his burden, his glory, his crown. You're still standing in the plaza's glow, the heavy air pressing close, when your attention shifts from the king's still figure to the strange thought, how many lives are tied up in those feathers? Because here's the truth. You can't just pluck a 10-foot plume out of the jungle like it's a dandelion. Each piece up there was worth more than jade, more than cacao, more than almost anything you could slip into a trader's pouch. Jade was heavy, gold was scarce, but feathers? Feathers could move an entire network of hands, from distant mountain villages to riverside markets. And the Mayans knew it. A single quetzal-tail feather, emerald green, over 2 feet long, was treated like currency in its own right. Macaw feathers, with their searing reds and sunny yellows, could only come from certain regions, sometimes hundreds of miles away. You don't just send your cousin to pick some up. You form a caravan, guard it like treasure, and pray no rival decides those feathers would look better on their own ruler's head. It's easy to forget that in a world without trains, ships with iron hulls, or even decent roads, expensive didn't just mean rare. It meant dangerous to get. Feather traders had to navigate swamps, mountains, and rivers, and not all of those obstacles were made of stone or water. A jaguar in the underbrush is a hazard. A rival city-state's raiding party is a threat. You can almost imagine 2 groups meeting on a narrow jungle path, one carrying bundles of bright feathers, the other eyeing those bundles like they were already theirs. Negotiation could mean swapping goods or swapping blows. The mainstream fact historians agree on is that feathers weren't just decorative, they were political. To gift a ruler a bundle of rare plumes was to acknowledge their status, to curry favor, or to seal an alliance. It wasn't just, here's something pretty for your head. It was, here's a symbol of the bond between us, one that others will see fluttering above your brow when you stand before your people. Now for the quirky tidbit. The value wasn't always about color or size. Some feathers were treasured because of how they caught the light in motion. You could have 2 nearly identical plumes, but one would shimmer in torchlight like a living flame, while the other just sat there. And in a ceremony, under the gaze of hundreds, shimmer mattered. So, traders became connoisseurs, turning feathers in their hands, holding them at different angles, squinting in the sun like a jeweler inspecting diamonds. Historians still argue whether the tribute records we have, lists of feathers counted in hundreds, were actual physical counts or symbolic tallies. Imagine trying to keep track of, say, 842 tail feathers in a humid, insect-filled room without losing your sanity. Did they really count each one? Or was 100 shorthand for a lot, enough to make a headdress so big you'll strain your neck? You shift in your place, feeling the invisible web that connects this crown to distant places you can't even see. Somewhere far to the south, a hunter stands under a dripping canopy, peering up at a flash of green in the branches. Somewhere to the west, a market square hums with barter, salt for fish, cacao for feathers, while women sit weaving bright cords to bind those plumes together. Somewhere else entirely, a canoe glides silently down a river, its cargo wrapped in plantain leaves to keep the feathers dry. Your gaze returns to the crown, and you wonder how many miles it contains, not in physical height, but in the journeys embedded in it. Each color is a different road. Each shimmer is a river crossed. Each layered row is a memory of the hands that touched it, the risks taken to carry it here, the silent pride of the people who know their work will be seen by thousands. The king shifts his weight slightly, and a ripple moves through the feathers, like a sigh you can see. The movement draws your eye to the long emerald plumes trailing down his back, almost brushing the carved steps. They sway gently, as though the air itself is acknowledging their worth. In that moment, you understand something simple but powerful. This is not just fashion. This is a walking treasury. And the vault, for now, is the head of a single man standing above an entire city. A light breeze rolls in again, carrying with it the mingled scents of roasting maize and crushed flowers. Somewhere nearby, someone laughs softly, a quick, breathy sound, as if they too are marveling at the sight. And above it all, the crown glows in the torchlight, worth more than jade, more than gold, and perhaps even more than the man who wears it. The king hasn't moved much since you arrived, but your eyes wander again, this time following the imagined path back into the jungle, where the crown's most prized feathers first began. You think about the quetzal, a bird so beautiful that it seems impossible it evolved for any reason other than pure decoration. Long, iridescent tail, plumes trailing like green waterfalls, a breast tinted with a shimmer of scarlet, wings that flash in sunlight like liquid emerald. And yet, despite its striking appearance, spotting one in the wild is like catching a ghost in mid-step. To find it, you'd have to travel to the highland cloud forests, places where the air itself feels heavy with water, and mist coils around the trees like sleeping serpents. The ground is soft with centuries of fallen leaves, and every step sends up the scent of moss and earth. You move slowly, not because you want to, though there is beauty here worth savoring, but because the forest demands it. The canopy overhead is so dense that light filters down in patches, each a small, green-tinted spotlight. Somewhere up there, in the tangle of branches, the quetzal perches, silent as the clouds. Mainstream accounts tell us that the ancient Mayan never killed the quetzal for its feathers, not because they were sentimental about birds, but because they understood the resource better alive. The tail plumes regrow each year, which meant a skilled hunter could trap the bird, pluck it gently, and release it back into the forest, ensuring future harvests. Think of it as renewable feather farming, except the farm is a vertical maze of slippery branches, and the livestock has wings and zero interest in cooperating. The quirky reality? These hunters weren't just men. Some records and oral traditions suggest women, too, learned the techniques, quiet patience, perfect timing, and the ability to read the bird's habits. The quetzal's call was said to give away its position, but here's where it gets tricky. In the thick forest, sound plays tricks. What you think is ahead could be behind you, above you, or nowhere near at all. Hunters had to use a mix of listening, scanning for subtle movements, and an uncanny kind of instinct, like sensing when the air shifts before a storm. Historians still argue whether the Mayan method of trapping involved intricate woven nets tossed upward or clever use of sticky sap smeared on branches where the bird might land. Both methods appear in colonial-era descriptions, but the sources often contradict each other. One Spanish chronicler insists the Mayans whistled in imitation of the quetzal, luring it down into a loop of cord. Another swears they used decoy birds carved from wood, painted with crushed mineral pigments, then placed high in the canopy to trigger curiosity. Maybe both are true, or maybe each was just one hunter's closely guarded trick. You imagine the moment of success, a flash of green movement, a sudden flutter, and then the hunter's hands, sure, quick, practiced, gently holding a living jewel. The plumes are long and silky, each one bending without breaking. The hunter will pluck only the tail feathers, never harming the bird's body. And then, just as carefully, the quetzal is set free, vanishing back into the trees with an indignant burst of wings. The journey doesn't end there. The feathers have to be carried out of the highlands, protected from moisture, insects, and rough handling. Hunters might wrap them in soft bark cloth, then in woven reed tubes for extra protection. Days later, when they finally arrive at a lowland city, the feathers emerge from their wrapping like sunlight from clouds, astonishing even those who have seen them before. You picture the traders who deal in these plumes, men and women with eyes sharp enough to tell a perfect quetzal feather from an almost perfect one in seconds. They run their fingers along the shaft to test for splits, tilt the plume against the light to see if the shimmer holds, and decide instantly whether it belongs in the crown of a king or in the ornament of a noble warrior. The drums in the plaza slow again, and a chant begins to rise. You glance back at the king, the moonlight catching the very Quetzal feathers you've been picturing. They sway like slow-moving streams, each one holding the memory of misty mornings, damp earth, and the heartbeat of a bird still alive somewhere in the highlands. And for a strange, fleeting moment, you realize that the crown is not just a symbol of power. It's a map of journeys you can never quite trace, of forests you may never walk, and of birds you may never see, but whose presence you feel, shimmering in the humid night air. The crown above you is not just a collection of feathers. It's the end result of a slow, painstaking craft that demands a patience you can barely imagine. You let your gaze drift from the towering plumes to the band that holds them in place, and then you picture the dim interior of a Mayan artisan's workshop. There's no sound of hammers striking metal here, no smell of molten gold. Instead, the air is thick with the scent of resins and plant gums, with the faint tang of crushed minerals that will later become paints. You crouch in the corner of this imagined workshop, watching the master featherworker, someone who might never stand on a pyramid summit, but whose hands will send their work there. The man, or sometimes a woman, depending on the city, sits cross-legged on a woven mat, surrounded by small bundles of sorted feathers, long Quetzal tails, fiery macaw plumes, tiny iridescent hummingbird feathers no bigger than a fingernail. Each bundle is wrapped in bark cloth to keep it safe from moisture and dust, like precious scrolls of color waiting for their place in the grand design. The mainstream fact here is that Mayan featherwork was a formal, specialized trade. These artisans weren't general crafters dabbling in decoration. They were trained from childhood, sometimes within family guilds, to know exactly how to cut, shape, layer, and bind feathers so they would last through years of ceremonies. And the process was as much about engineering as art. Here's the quirky part. Some glues were made from orchid bulbs boiled into a sticky paste, while others came from the hardened sap of certain jungle trees, sap that had to be collected during the hottest part of the day when it flowed freely. In some towns, glue making was a separate specialty, with its own closely guarded recipes. A bad batch could ruin weeks of work, too brittle, and the feathers would snap off mid-ceremony. Too soft, and the whole thing might slump forward at the wrong moment. Imagine the king's crown suddenly tilting like a wilting sunflower in the middle of a sacred ritual. Historians still argue whether the largest crowns were assembled in one piece or made in sections that could be joined on the day of the ceremony. If you've ever tried to carry anything taller than yourself through a crowded street, you'll understand why the modular theory makes sense. Some depictions in surviving codices show feathered fans being inserted into a headband, suggesting the whole towering shape could be built like a puzzle. You lean closer in your mind's eye, watching the artisan select one perfect plume from the bundle. He trims the base with a flake of obsidian, so sharp it could split a hair. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, he slides it into a narrow slot in the crown's frame, often made from thin cane or light wood, and secures it with a dab of glue and a wrapping of fine cotton thread. Every angle matters. A feather pointing just slightly off could ruin the symmetry, and symmetry was sacred. Around him, assistants sort the next set of feathers, passing them like surgical tools. Their fingers are stained from the pigments used to dye certain plumes into colors the jungle couldn't provide naturally. Deep blues from indigo, purples from crushed shells, yellows from the bright turmeric root. Sometimes these dyes were layered over natural colors to create an effect that shimmered and shifted in light, a trick that made the crown seem alive when the king moved. The room is quiet except for the occasional soft swish of feathers sliding against each other and the low murmur of measured conversation. In this quiet, there's an intensity that's almost devotional. The artisan isn't just making a hat. He's making a statement that will be seen by the gods, the ancestors, and every pair of eyes in the city. You blink, and you're back in the plaza, looking up at the finished product. Those Quetzal feathers, layered so precisely they seem to float, aren't just sitting there. They're locked in a place by glue brewed on a hot afternoon months ago. The crimson macaw feathers near the base have been trimmed to exact lengths, so they curve outward in perfect arcs. The tiny hummingbird feathers, tucked into the headband's edge, form a shimmering green border that catches the torchlight. The drums pick up again, and the crown sways slightly, revealing how the feathers overlap in perfect harmony. Not a single gap, not a single awkward angle. Every inch is the result of days, sometimes weeks, of bending over a mat, adjusting, regluing, relayering until it was flawless. And you realize that somewhere, in a quiet house in this city, the artisan who made this crown is probably listening to these same drums tonight, knowing their work is at the very top of the pyramid, catching the moonlight, holding the gaze of thousands. The drums are no longer just a distant heartbeat. They've thickened into a steady pulse that makes the very air vibrate. The crowd in the plaza below swells with movement, voices rising in a wave of anticipation. You shift your weight on the stone steps, feeling the warmth of the limestone seep through the soles of your sandals, and your eyes go back to the figure at the top. The king raises his arms, and the crown answers, not with words, but with light. Every feather catches the blaze of the sun, for this ceremony takes place under a day sky so bright it bleaches the edges of everything. The plaza, vast and open, is a sea of white stone reflecting heat like a second sun. And yet, here at the center, a single point of color burns like a living flame. Mainstream historians tell us that these great public festivals were often tied to the Mayan calendar's most important dates: eclipses, equinoxes, and the completion of certain time cycles. On days like this, the king wasn't just a political leader. He was the human bridge between his people and the divine. Every movement he made was deliberate, rehearsed, symbolic. Even the way his crown tilted in the light had meaning. The quirky twist? Not all spectators were close enough to actually see the king's face. In large cities, the plaza might hold thousands, most clustered far from the main pyramid. For them, the crown was the real focal point. Its colors and size made it visible from almost anywhere, a kind of ancient signal flag announcing, here is the center of the world. Here is where the gods touch the earth. Historians still argue whether the feather crowns were worn for the entire length of these ceremonies, which could last from dawn to sunset, or only for key moments before being set aside for lighter headdresses. The truth might lie somewhere in between. Even the strongest neck would ache after hours of balancing such weight, and tropical heat would make the feathers stick unpleasantly to skin. From where you stand now, the king appears almost motionless, but there's a subtle sway to him, as if his body moves with the weight on his head. The feathers ripple with every shift, creating flashes of green, red, and blue that seem to float above him. You imagine the artisans in the crowd, watching their work perform exactly as intended, each plume bending with the breeze, catching the light, making the king appear both taller and more untouchable. The sun presses down, and the heat rises from the stone in shimmering waves. You smell roasted maize, the faint musk of sweat from bodies pressed together, and the sharp, sweet tang of copal incense drifting from burning bowls carried by priests in long, embroidered robes. The priests circle the base of the pyramid, tossing handfuls of flower petals onto the steps. The king begins to descend slowly, each step deliberate. As he moves, the crown shifts and sways, not too much, but enough to animate the feathers like living creatures. This is no accident. Mayan dancers, warriors, and rulers all knew how to use movement to make their feathered ornaments speak to the crowd. A slow turn could make the long quetzal tails sweep dramatically to one side. A bow of the head could make them cascade forward like a green waterfall. By the time he reaches the plaza, the air is a tapestry of sound. Drums, rattles, low chants from hundreds of throats. You can feel the vibrations in your bones. Children crane their necks to see the crown. Elders nod solemnly, remembering other kings, other festivals. And here's something to notice. Not a single feather looks out of place, despite the heat, the motion, and the hours of ceremony. That's a testament to the glue and bindings, yes, but also to the sheer pride poured into every stage of making this crown. It's not just an accessory. It's a living emblem of a city's power, wealth, and connection to the divine. The king pauses in the center of the plaza, and the crowd falls silent. For a heartbeat, all you can hear is the rustle of feathers in the hot breeze, a sound as soft as breath, but carrying the weight of centuries. The heat clings to you like wet cloth as you shuffle across the plaza, and the low hum of conversation from the gathered crowd is drowned out by the beating of drums. You can feel the sound in your ribs. Ahead, the king steps into the light. His hat, or maybe we should just start calling it an engineered miracle, rises so high it nearly brushes the carved stone lintel behind him. Tonight is no battle. It's the festival of renewal, a time when even the most fearsome warriors wear smiles and carry cups instead of spears. Still, there's a competitive gleam in his eyes. This hat isn't just about beauty tonight. It's a scoreboard. Each feather and woven jewel represents a victory, a tribute, a deal struck in his favor. It's the social media profile pic of the 9th century, only more flammable. Somewhere in the chaos, you spot the hat maker, grinning like a man who just got a new donkey and maybe a better roof for his workshop. He knows every plume is perfectly placed, every angle designed to catch torchlight and moonlight in equal measure. You can smell roasted maize and cacao in the air. A boy runs past you carrying a steaming bowl of something that looks suspiciously like it could take the roof off your mouth if you're not careful. His head is shaved except for one tuft, dyed bright red. Another small nod to the feather theme. The king raises his arms, and the crowd hushes instantly. He tilts the brim of his feather crown just slightly, letting the iridescent greens shimmer like waves in a lagoon. In the flicker of torchlight, the hat almost seems alive. Historians still argue whether the feathers were meant to represent specific deities or simply the abstract concept of divine abundance. But in this moment, it doesn't matter. The crowd's collective sigh tells you they believe in whatever story the king is telling, because he's wearing it. A group of traveling dancers begins their performance, swirling in tunics embroidered with smaller plumes, their ankles jingling with shell bells. You notice that the pattern of their movements mirrors the spiral design woven into the king's hat. Nothing here is by accident. Even the music feels like it's looping and curling upward, chasing the same spiral to its peak. Somewhere behind you, two older men argue softly over whether the blue macaw feathers are more valuable than the yellow, or if the yellow are just harder to find now that certain birds are nesting farther away. One swears that the blue symbolizes rain, the other insists it's sky power. You file both ideas away, half listening, half focused on the way the feathers ripple when the king nods to the rhythm. Then comes the hat tilt, a subtle, practice move, just enough to catch the torchlight and dazzle the front row. The reaction is instant. Gasps, murmurs, a few exaggerated bows. It's the ancient equivalent of dropping the mic. And while everyone else is caught up in the spectacle, you realize something. You're watching not just a ruler enjoying a festival, but a masterclass in public relations. This hat is the message, the medium, and the magic trick all at once. As the night deepens, the torches cast longer, warmer shadows across the plaza stones, and the air takes on that strange, almost metallic coolness that comes right before dawn. The king has stepped down from the main platform now, moving among his people, and the hat, well, the hat floats above the crowd like a ship's sail. You can see it from anywhere, bobbing slightly as he walks, always steady, never tipping too far despite its impossible weight. The hat's construction is even more impressive up close. The frame seems to be woven from a kind of reed, light yet rigid, its intersections lashed with dyed cord. The feathers are layered like shingles on a roof, each one angled just enough to create the illusion of movement, even when the wearer is still. Between the layers, you notice slivers of polished shell and thin strips of hammered gold that catch stray bits of torchlight like fishing hooks catching sunlight. A woman beside you whispers to her daughter, "That's the rainmaker's crown." She says it the way someone today might say, "That's the Mona Lisa." The little girl stares, her eyes wide, one hand clutching a small, toy carved from wood. They say, the mother continues, "When he wears it, the clouds come closer." And here's the thing, whether you believe or not, the sky above does look different now. The stars seem slightly muted, as if some invisible curtain has drawn itself across the heavens. It could just be the night fog rolling in from the hills. Or it could be that the people here have collectively decided to believe it's a sign. The king pauses to greet a group of traders who have traveled from far to the east. Their own hats are impressive, smaller, flatter, with brims decorated in beads and bits of coral. The moment their eyes land on his crown, you can see the mental arithmetic happening. Admiration plus envy, multiplied by the quiet calculation of what such a hat might be worth back home. Nearby, the hat maker is surrounded by apprentices, each carrying bundles of feathers wrapped in cloth. He's already taking orders, because every man here tonight, and quite a few women, are thinking the same thing. I need one of those. Someone offers you a drink, thick and bitter with cacao, topped with a dash of chili that nearly clears your sinuses. You sip, cough politely, and glance back toward the king just in time to see him tilt his hat again, this time toward the Eastern traders. It's a greeting, a challenge, and a sales pitch all rolled into one. Above the music and chatter, you can hear a faint fluttering, not from birds, but from the feathers themselves, stirred by the breeze. And you think, in an age without printed banners, without loudspeakers or glowing screens, maybe this was the loudest statement you could make. Not by shouting, but by letting the wind do the talking through a crown that could rival the sky. The plaza begins to quiet as twilight fades into night, but your eyes are still drawn upward to that remarkable hat. It seems to defy gravity, balancing like a bird's nest atop the king's head, almost daring the wind to challenge it. You wonder how anyone could carry such a thing for long without turning into a human wobbleboard. The neck muscles must have been built like tree trunks, or maybe the king just possessed some ancient superpower that hasn't made it into modern physiology textbooks yet. The structure beneath the feathers is as impressive as the plumage itself. Made from light wood and cane, bound tightly with cords dyed in vibrant hues, it forms a scaffold that distributes weight evenly. Engineering and artistry fused in one delicate frame. You can imagine the sensation of the wind catching the feather tips, creating a soft rustling, a whispering sound like the leaves in the jungle at dusk. It's probably the only noise the king hears as he stands, proud and still, in the middle of his people. Here's a quirky thought. Some accounts suggest that special padding, maybe woven cotton or stuffed plant fibers, was used under the headdress to protect the wearer's scalp from the crown's weight and to keep it steady during long ceremonies. You might picture a king secretly humming lullabies to his own neck muscles, training them to endure the load without complaint. The daily head-bobbing practice sessions that probably never made it into official chronicles. Historians still argue whether the tallest feathered crowns were practical or purely ceremonial. Could the king have worn them outside of rituals, or were they reserved strictly for moments of spectacle? Some suggest the grandest hats were kept carefully stored and only brought out to impress visiting dignitaries or during the most important calendar events. Others believe the king might have worn smaller, lighter versions more frequently to maintain his aura of divine power without succumbing to neck cramps. As you gaze up, a gentle breeze brushes the feathers, setting them to a subtle dance. The crown's colors shimmer in the moonlight, casting kaleidoscopic patterns onto the carved stone beneath the king's feet. It feels as though the hat is alive, breathing with the spirit of the jungle itself, a quiet, shimmering testament to a civilization's love affair with beauty, power, and the natural world. The tropical night settles in fully now, thick and warm, with a faint chorus of cicadas buzzing in the distance and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. You feel the sticky weight of humidity on your skin, the same humidity that must have been the constant nemesis of those feathered crowns. Delicate feathers, no matter how carefully arranged or expertly glued, have a delicate relationship with moisture, a relationship that's both nurturing and dangerous. You imagine the constant battle that artisans and kings alike faced. How to keep the feathers pristine under the relentless rainstorms, in the sweat-soaked heat of the long ceremonies, and amid the thick jungle air teeming with insects eager to feast. Feathers don't like water. They lose their luster when damp and can become brittle if dried too harshly. One drop of rain could ruin weeks of painstaking work. Mainstream history tells us that the Mayans developed clever methods to protect their prized featherwork. Feathered garments and crowns were often stored wrapped in delicate layers of bark cloth and kept in dry, elevated places when not in use. Sometimes they were treated with natural oils or plant extracts to repel moisture and insects. You might think of it as an ancient version of feather-proofing spray, only made from jungle chemistry passed down through generations. Here's the quirky detail. There are stories, some told by the Spanish chroniclers, that the king's attendants would carry special umbrellas made from woven palm fronds or animal hides, held aloft to shield the king's crown from rain and even the harshest midday sun. So, as impressive as the feather crowns were, they weren't entirely left to the mercy of the elements. It was a full-time job, just keeping them in shape. Historians still debate how often these giant feather hats were repaired or remade. Some argue that the crowns were durable, lasting for years if carefully maintained. Others suggest that the most elaborate pieces were seasonal, reconstructed for each major event with fresh feathers and glue. This debate touches on the broader question of how much labor and resources the Maya could sustainably devote to such luxury in the context of their society's economic and environmental limits. You can almost hear the soft murmur of the king's attendants moving quietly behind him, smoothing out stray feathers, adjusting small sections to keep the perfect silhouette intact. Sweat beads form on your forehead as you imagine how the king himself endured the heat and weight, his skin damp, but his posture regal and unyielding. Every ripple of feather and fold of fabric is part of an intricate performance that sustains his authority in the eyes of the people and the gods. The night breeze picks up again, stirring the feathers into a slow, shimmering wave. The play of shadow and light across the crown feels like the jungle breathing, a fragile, beautiful echo of life itself. And you realize that keeping the crown perfect was as much a spiritual duty as a practical one, a continuous ritual of care and respect woven into the very fabric of Mayan power. The night deepens, and with it, the soft hum of the plaza's activity fades into a gentle lull. You find yourself thinking about the meaning wrapped into the feathers' colors and shapes, because this crown wasn't just an extravagant accessory, it was a language. Each shade, each pattern, each layer spoke volumes to those who knew how to read it. Take the vibrant reds of the scarlet macaw feathers, for instance. Their fiery hues symbolize the sun's life-giving power and the fierce energy of warriors. These feathers were prized not only for their beauty, but because they represented strength and vitality. Meanwhile, the deep greens of the quetzal feathers evoke the lushness of the jungle and the eternal renewal of life. A perfect metaphor for a king whose rule was meant to bring prosperity and continuity. The layering of feathers wasn't random, either. Some historians argue that certain patterns mimicked sacred animals or celestial events, embedding the king's headwear with layers of cosmic significance. One popular theory is that the way the feathers radiated outward reflected the rays of the sun or the flight of sacred birds. Others suggest the arrangement might have represented the connection between earth, sky, and underworld, fundamental elements of Mayan cosmology. Here's a quirky angle. There are reports from colonial-era sources that some feather artisans experimented with tiny mirrors and polished stones sewn in the crowns, creating dazzling effects when caught by sunlight or torchlight. Imagine the spectacle, tiny flashes of light bouncing off thousands of feathers and glittering gems, transforming the king into a walking constellation, a mobile galaxy in human form. Historians still argue about the extent to which these feather crowns were standardized versus personalized. Was there a rigid template for how many rows of feathers or which colors to include? Or did individual kings and their artisans customize each hat to reflect personal achievements, alliances, or even moods? The evidence is tantalizingly ambiguous. Some depictions suggest a standard royal style, while others show wildly different designs, hinting at a rich tradition of personal expression within the framework of ceremonial dress. You close your eyes and try to picture the king's reflection, not in a mirror, but in the eyes of his subjects. The crown tells them who he is, where his power comes from, and what he promises. It's a silent language spoken not with words, but with color, texture, and light, carried on the fragile wings of birds and the delicate skill of human hands. As you linger on that image, the king is a living constellation, a walking map of power and nature. You can't help but wonder about the stories whispered behind closed doors, the secret meanings embedded in the feathers that only a few would ever know. Because this wasn't just public spectacle, it was also a private code. A language of symbolism layered like the feathers themselves, for the eyes of priests, nobles, and maybe even the king alone. In many Mayan cities, religion and politics were inseparable, and the feather crown, was a tangible link between them. Priests interpreted celestial events, communed with gods, and led rituals designed to sustain the balance of the universe. The king's crown connected him directly to this divine order. Wearing it was a daily reminder that he carried the cosmos on his head, literally. A quirky tidbit here. Some Mayan myths speak of feathered serpents, creatures that were neither bird nor snake, but something magical in between. These creatures, called Kukulkan or Quetzalcoatl in related cultures, symbolized wisdom, renewal, and the fluid connection between earth and sky. Some scholars speculate that feather crowns might have been designed to evoke these mythic beings, making the king a living avatar of their power. Historians still debate how much these mythic associations influenced the design of the crowns versus more practical political symbolism. Was the hat an intentional nod to divine creatures, or simply a way to display wealth and power? Maybe it was both, a beautiful, complicated mix of theology and pageantry. You imagine the king alone in his chamber after the festival, the crown set carefully on a carved pedestal, its feathers catching the flickering light of an oil lamp. Perhaps he reaches out, fingers brushing a quetzal plume, reminding himself of his duty to the gods and his people. The hat is no longer just an ornament. It is a sacred responsibility, a mantle of cosmic order balanced on his brow. The night deepens, and the stars above seem to pulse faintly, as if echoing the rhythms of that feathered crown far below. And as you stand there, you understand that this hat is not merely made of feathers. It is woven from stories, myths, journeys, and the hopes of an entire civilization. The festival's energy begins to ebb as the night wears on, and the crowd slowly disperses, their murmurs fading into the sounds of the jungle reclaiming its territory. But the king remains, seated atop the pyramid steps, still wearing the feathered crown as if it were a second skin. The weight, both physical and symbolic, hangs heavy, but he carries it with the quiet dignity expected of him. You consider the challenges that must have come with such an adornment beyond the obvious. How did the king sleep when the crown was off? Did he dream of feathers brushing his face? Did the enormity of the crown ever become a burden in ways no one could see? After all, the feathered headdress was not just a symbol of power, but also a visible reminder of the responsibilities, alliances, and rivalries woven into the very fabric of Maya society. Here's a curious detail. In some Mayan cities, only certain classes were permitted to wear feathered garments or crowns. Commoners might wear simple feather decorations, but the enormous, intricate crowns with quetzal and macaw feathers were exclusive to royalty and the highest priests. The feathered crown was as much a social barrier as a ceremonial object, visible proof of status that could never be faked. Historians still argue about how portable these feathered crowns really were. Some believe the largest examples were cumbersome enough to require assistance just to be worn safely, possibly even supported by specially trained attendants who helped the king move or stand during long ceremonies. Others think the crowns were designed with surprising lightness and balance, enabling kings to move with grace and authority. You picture the team of attendants who stand ready just behind the throne, vigilant and quiet, ready to adjust feathers, rebind loose threads, or steady the crown should it begin to shift. Theirs is a role of immense trust and skill, one that requires a deep understanding of the intricate featherwork and the king's movements. The moon dips low, casting pale light over the feathered crown, illuminating every curve and color. It is a symbol not only of majesty, but of a living tradition, of hands that plucked feathers in distant forests, artisans who shaped those feathers into masterpieces, and a king who bore it all, a walking embodiment of power, beauty, and responsibility. The night's calm is punctuated only by the distant calls of night birds and the rustling of leaves in a gentle wind. The king's feathered crown seems to absorb the stillness, glowing softly under the stars like a beacon from a forgotten world. You realize that this hat, more than just an object of wealth and status, was a living narrative, one that connected earth, sky, and the human spirit in a seamless weave. Imagine, for a moment, the countless hands that contributed to its creation. The hunters in misty cloud forests, the traders navigating rivers and mountain passes, the dyers preparing vibrant pigments from minerals and plants, and the artisans patiently assembling the delicate layers. Each feather carries a story of its own, a fragment of culture and nature bound together in a single, breathtaking crown. There's a quirky note here. Some Maya artists were said to incorporate feathers from rare hummingbirds whose iridescent plumage seemed to change color with the angle of light, creating shifting patterns that made the crown shimmer like a living thing. Capturing and preserving these feathers was no small feat and added an almost magical quality to the finished piece. Historians still debate whether feathered crowns were ever used in warfare or strictly reserved for ceremonial and religious occasions. The idea of a heavily feathered hat in battle seems impractical, too heavy, too fragile. Yet some records suggest that smaller feathered ornaments, inspired by these grand crowns, may have been worn by elite warriors to signal rank and inspire awe on the battlefield. You imagine the king, moments before a ceremony, standing before a mirror made from polished obsidian, adjusting his crown, knowing that this moment is both a performance and a pact. The crown doesn't just adorn him, it transforms him. It elevates him from mortal to divine, from ruler to legend. The wind picks up again, rustling the feathers gently, as if the jungle itself breathes life into this magnificent creation. It's a silent dance between nature and culture, power and beauty, past and present, all woven into the crowning glory of a king who ruled not just with force, but with vision and art. As the dawn edges near, the first pale light stretches across the sky, softening shadows and bathing the stone pyramid in a gentle glow. The king's crown, once ablaze with vibrant colors under the sun and torchlight, now takes on a quieter, more contemplative hue. The feathers seem almost translucent in the early light, delicate as morning mist. You imagine the king preparing for rest, the heavy crown finally lifted and carefully placed upon a carved pedestal in his chamber. There, away from the eyes of the city, the crown becomes more than a symbol. It's a cherished relic, a fragile treasure requiring careful protection. The artisans who made it may have visited regularly to repair, replace, or refresh the feathers, tending it as one might tend a sacred garden. Here's a curious detail. Some accounts describe how the oldest, most revered crowns were passed down through generations, each king adding his own touches while preserving the original structure. It was less about personal ownership and more about stewardship, caring for a symbol that connected past rulers with future ones, weaving a continuous thread of authority and tradition. Historians still debate how these crowns influenced neighboring cultures. Featherwork was widespread throughout Mesoamerica, but the Maya developed particularly elaborate and symbolic designs. Did their feather crowns inspire the Aztec headdresses, which were equally spectacular? Or were these traditions parallel evolutions rooted in shared but distinct cultural values? The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive. You picture the ritual of donning the crown anew, the careful adjustments, the whispered prayers, and the weight settling once more on the king's head. It's a daily recommitment, a physical and spiritual act that reminds everyone involved of their place in a complex, beautiful world. The city around you begins to stir as the jungle awakens, birds calling and leaves rustling in the morning breeze. The crown, now resting quietly, waits patiently for the next festival, the next ceremony, the next moment to blaze once again like a living star atop the king's brow. Morning unfolds softly, the cool light filtering through the high canopy as the city awakens. The king's crown rests quietly, its feathers still shimmering faintly in the new day, catching every stray beam like tiny fragments of the jungle itself. You feel the weight of all that has come before. The journeys of feathers from distant cloud forests, the patient hands of artisans, the chants of the plaza, all wrapped up in this one magnificent object. This crown was never just a hat. It was a living story, a bridge between the mortal and the divine, between earth and sky, between past and future. Each plume was a thread in a tapestry of power, belief, and identity woven by a people deeply connected to their world. The more you think about it, the more the feathered crown feels like a kind of heartbeat, a steady pulse of tradition, artistry, and reverence beating through centuries. There's a quiet magic in knowing that such beauty was crafted without modern tools, that something so fragile could carry such weight, both literal and symbolic. You imagine the king once more, lifting the crown, feeling the soft feathers brush his skin, and taking a deep breath before stepping into his role as the living link to the gods. Historians continue to uncover new layers of meaning and mystery around these feathered crowns, but one thing is clear. Their legacy is not just in museum cases or dusty codices, but in the imagination they inspire. They remind us how deeply human beings have always been drawn to beauty, to symbol, and to the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Now, as the city hums with the promise of a new day, you feel yourself beginning to drift, carried gently by the rhythm of ancient drums fading into silence, feathers rustling in the breeze, and the soft, endless sky.